This is GARIS, Masculist MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 400. Ta-da! Part 2, entitled A Biconscious Feminist Talks to a Monoconscious Feminist. Carrying straight on.
The radical masculists see the fluffy feminists in the divorce courts who oppose the legislation of the para so forcefully as both sexist hypocrites and as indirect genociders, since they are indirectly responsible for the crash of the birth rate, since so many young men now reject marriage and paternity, given that these fluffy feminists have made divorce so toxic for men. The radical masculists are saying that these genociders have to be stopped with bullets if necessary, since when whole populations are threatened with being wiped out, they go to war to prevent that. The radical masculists are talking increasingly about a sex war in which the gender politicians who made the deeply misandrous gender laws in the first place will be assassinated. Thousands of fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges will be murdered. And if the sex war really heats up, then masculine soldiers may go out into the street and simply shoot monoconscious feminists. That is, a woman like you. F1. Shit! It sounds repulsive, but I'm smart enough to see the logic behind it, so it really scares me. I can imagine a lot of smart men being strongly influenced by such ideas, since they hold water. I see that. If I were a divorcing father and came across these radical masculist ideas, they would turn my head. I can imagine getting really angry and want to change things.
F2.
As a monoconscious feminist, it's likely in the next few years, as you meet more and more feminists like me, that is, biconscious feminists, there will be growing tensions within the feminist movement, as feminists take sides between being either monoconscious or biconscious. Personally, I think it's likely that there may even be a split in the feminist movement over the issue of whether to be biconscious or not. My boyfriend keeps asking me whether there are lots of biconscious feminists yet, enough to force the issue within the feminist movement. I tell him not yet, but I can imagine it. I meet more and more biconscious feminists like myself in my own social circle. So in the next few years, there will be so many of us that we will begin to be a political force capable of moving the feminist movement more along a female masculist trajectory. It's possible. The more conservative monoconscious feminists will see the growing biconscious feminists as traitors, selling out to men, that is, to the masculist movement, and hence should be despised, even thrown out of the feminist movement. The biconscious feminists will probably see the monoconscious feminists as bigots, being closed-minded to the very reasonable arguments of the masculists, especially in regard to the horrible gender injustices committed against men in the divorce courts, and not having the para when women have the mara, etc. So I anticipate that the biconscious feminists will be the smarter group of feminists and will look down on the more conservative, more traditional monoconscious feminists. Biconscious feminists also argue that it's in feminist self-interest as women to be biconscious, since to a man, a misandrist, male-dumping, feminazi bitch of a woman is utterly repulsive to him. So such women tend to be boyfriendless, so are loveless, sexless, and especially are deprived of being given men's sperm. A monoconscious feminist is much more likely to be feminazi bitchy because feminism has taught her how men oppress women, so she's angry at men for that. But because she's not biconscious, that is, she has not had her masculine consciousness raised, she is not aware of how women oppress men. For example, with women's financial parasitism, women's manslavery, women's fluffy feminist hypocrisy in the divorce courts, women's many decades-lasting gender crimes against men. For example, paternity fraud, where in about 5% of pregnancies the husband is not the father. And women's pill lying, where the woman tells her husband/boyfriend that she's taking the pill, but isn't, gets pregnant, then forces her man to pay for the kid for decades, manslaving him for decades, etc. The masculists are pushing hard for the legislation of the para, so that such problems can be avoided by men, so that a man is not forced into an unwanted pregnancy, an unwanted paternity. Women have the mara, men don't have the para. As the masculists say, this difference is the greatest form of sexual discrimination that exists, and it's not against women, but against men. When a feminist becomes biconscious, her feminist anger at men for the ways that men oppress women is usually cancelled by a corresponding masculist anger at women for the ways that women oppress men, so that on balance she loses her feminazi bitchiness, since she can see that the masculists have a good case and that men have every right to feel that they are abused by women, and that in the eyes of many masculists, men are oppressed far worse by women than vice versa, since women's oppression of men is continuous and lasts decades. So, when a monoconscious feminist converts herself into a biconscious feminist, she tends to lose her feminazi bitchiness. She becomes much nicer, and that makes her much more approachable by men, so that she is much more likely to have a boyfriend, so is given affection, sex, and even babies, although being given their boyfriend's sperm is unlikely in the coming years until the gender laws are men-faired, that is, the divorce courts are reformed and the para, etc. is legislated. The masculists are now preaching to young women on campus and in the high schools that it is very much in their self-interest to become biconscious by learning the ideas of the masculists, since those women who are quicker off the mark in becoming biconscious will be the preferred girlfriends of the quality men who will prefer a relationship with a biconscious feminist than a traditional monoconscious feminist, who will be much more likely to have negative attitudes towards him simply because he is male. Biconscious feminists are much nicer to men because they sympathise much more readily to the ways that women oppress men due to their knowledge of masculist ideas absorbed when they converted themselves into female masculists. The masculists want women to become biconscious and to vote with men for the men-fairing of the gender laws. Otherwise, millions of young men will continue to reject marriage and paternity, thus wiping out whole populations. But they are merely reacting to the toxicity of the divorce courts as created by the fluffy feminist hypocrites, who are seen as the real genociders who have to be stopped. With large numbers of biconscious women voting with men for the men-fairing of the gender laws, then the gender politicians will see that the combined vote of men plus the biconscious feminists is over 60%, thus forcing the gender politicians to give the masculists what they want or risk being voted out of power. Young women really want babies more than they want to keep their fluffy feminist privileges in the divorce courts, so will really listen to the masculists who will be preaching hard to these young women that they need to vote with men to men-fair the gender laws. Otherwise there will be a sex war and they will be forced to rot on the shelf, manless, sexless, babyless, and increasingly, as masculinist ideas spread through the culture, spat at. The 2020s are being seen increasingly as the decade for men, the masculists' decade, in which men wake up and throw off their man-slavery chains, who then go their own way, rejecting being parasited upon by fluffies, and who put enormous moral pressure on women to fip up and get a career-competent education. Masculists tell women that a fluffy can only be a fluffy if she can get her financial or her fluffy claws into some gullible manslave, But thanks to the MGTOW and masculist movements, the supply of such gullible, stupid, man-slavable men is drying up as masculist ideas spread through the culture, waking men up to the huge disadvantages of being a manslave to a hated, fluffy parasite. You can see that my brain has switched over to my female masculist side. I can give you lots of examples of how men oppress women, but that will be old hat to you, since like me, you are a feminist. But since I'm biconscious, I can think in both directions. I see clearly that gender oppression is a two-way street. For each way that men oppress women, I can think of a way that women oppress men, and I agree with the masculists that women oppress men far worse than vice versa, because women, especially fluffies and fluffy feminists, oppress men continuously and for decades. That phrase, for decades, occurs a lot in masculist rhetoric. It's important since it is true. So how is all this female masculist rhetoric affecting you? Do you think it's bullshit? Does any of it stick? Has my little spiel had much effect on you? F1.
To be honest, it's all so new that I need time to digest it. It's shocking. I'll say that. I can see that you take it very seriously, and your point about biconscious feminists being more likely to have boyfriends really resonates with me, since, being honest again, I'm afraid of losing my boyfriend, since I give him my feminist venom and anger too often for his tastes. He has sometimes threatened me with statements like,
"If you keep drowning me with your feminazi bullshit, you risk me dumping you," since even though I can identify with a lot of what you are saying about how men oppress women, being feminazi harangued all the time only destroys our relationship, since I would rather have a woman who is calm, nurturative, sexy and nice to be with, and not a feminazi bitchy, male-dumping shrew. You keep this up, and one day you may find I have just walked out on you, so be warned.
I dare say there are lots of feminists in my boat with boyfriends who are fed up with our feminist bitchiness. So I can imagine when their boyfriends get infected with the masculist virus, they will become intellectually armed with masculist ideas, and that will provide them with the rationale to dump us as monoconscious feminazi bitches. That's what really scares me. So I'm strongly motivated to study a lot more carefully what you are saying as a biconscious feminist, since it may be my lifeline to keeping my boyfriend, whom I really want to have kids with as a woman. I have a tendency to let fly with my monoconscious feminist ideology, not thinking how it must affect him, a male. I can imagine when he learns the masculist ideas that you have given me, that he will become a lot more intolerant towards my feminazi rants and prefer a biconscious feminist to have a relationship with. I can see that is on the cards, so I suppose I should be grateful to you for pulling the wool from my eyes. I find what you have said very disturbing, since I've been a feminist pretty much all my life. So hearing these masculist ideas is shocking to me, very disturbing, shaking up all that I've believed, almost like a religion, all my life, certainly all my adult life. So it will take a lot of psychological adjustment on my part to fully absorb what you have said to me. Can we keep in touch with emails, since I will probably have lots of questions? Can you give me links to masculist sites on the internet? And are there biconscious feminist groups I can join in our area? I sense that this masculist stuff is going to be as big a social and political change as feminism was in the 70s. I feel very ambivalent about what you have told me.
I feel threatened and exhilarated at the same time. I sense that by becoming biconscious, I will be more able to hold on to my boyfriend. But on the other hand, it will be extremely painful for me to throw off a lot of my beliefs. For example, that gender politics is feminist dominated, that gender oppression is a one-way street, that I have always believed in from the time I was capable of thinking such thoughts in my early teens. I need a drink. I feel drained, exhausted, crushed. I'm suffering cognitive dissonance thanks to you. I feel that today will seem like a real watershed looking back. That is, the day I discovered the masculist viewpoint, and that it made a lot of sense. I'm smart enough to see your logic, and it disturbs me. It really disturbs me.
Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man's Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 400 plus Masculist flyers for men's studies courses, freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.